Okay, we are sitting at Gallery 88, which is hosting an exhibition of popular prints from different presses and studios in Calcutta in a period broadly from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. The exhibition is called From the Prayer Room to the Parlour, Bengal's Print Legacy. But by print we mean different things. In this case, the print here is referring particularly to a particular genre of pictures, largely religious and mythological, but some also social images of beautiful, seductive women, but largely of religious and mythological themes. Some portraits we have also of great Bengalis. What unites this collection is the collector, Sanjeet Chowdhury. How many pictures are there in this exhibition altogether?
There are about 70 images.
70. Now they've come entirely out of his collection and he has many more. But this more or less represents his collection of prints from Bengal's lithography presses. The gallerist here, the person who set up the gallery is Supriya Banerjee, one of the pioneering galleries in Kolkata. She's part of the gallery movement in the 80s, and she will tell us a bit on how she got interested in this exhibition and whether you've shown this kind of picture before, Supriya.
Yeah, well, this is the second one of this kind of prints I'm showing in the gallery. I heard about these prints from Tapati many years ago. I didn't know Sanjeet at all. I knew his father, but Tapati told me that Sanjeet has a very good collection of prints, and I had remembered that. So he's been in touch with me about his photography. So I asked him one day, what about the prints? Why don't we show them? Basically, I want Calcutta to see these things, which are of many years ago, because the present generation, the present younger artists from the art schools, I think they should also see these things, It's part of their education, and I don't know what they know about it from colleges, but at least if I show them in the gallery, they can come and have a look. That is the idea of the younger generation. They should come and see these things.
I will begin by asking you, Jeet, about the collecting history of this category of pictures, which we can broadly call chromolithographs, oleographs, which are coming out of a set of presses in Kolkata, broadly from the period 1870s into the 1930s and 40s. Now, there are different names we've given to this genre of work. Popular prints, religious pictures, God pictures, but they're not only always of gods, they're social themes too. Now, this was considered a kind of cheap bazaar art that replaced the art of Kalighat and Bottala, using new technologies of printing, but also new languages of realism, a way of showing landscape, a way of showing the human anatomy. So, but they were kind of dismissed as a corrupt form of bazaar art and was largely ignored in art and art history circles. But let me go back to the time I began my research in this area. I was not working only on this, but I wanted to understand the impact that new painting and printing techniques and new styles had not just on a certain category of professional modern artists, but also more largely in the domain that we call the bazaar. So in the 1980s, I began thinking about it, and the reason was that I would come across some of this work in small private collections. They were not there in any large museums, but I would come across sometimes oil paintings, but many more would be these kinds of colorful prints, which the term that later scholars have used are chromolithographs, and later oleographs because they would use an oil-based print. So in the 1980s, I began noticing them in the collections of certain kind of collectors who were generally interested in popular art. So one of the main persons here who has been a mentor to both of us in different ways is of course R.P. Gupta. But same time, Komol Sarkar, who was a scholar, who first told me about Calcutta Art Studio and the fact that he had written on it. But there are other collectors too. There was somebody called Nihar Chakraborty, for instance, and there was also Shubho Thakur, who I never met, but I met his son Siddhartha Tagore, who had organized an exhibition very early on. I think it was at the Chitrakoot Art Gallery called The Call of the Flute. It was looking at the Krishna theme in these kinds of popular westernized pictures of the 8th century. So this is a scenario of the 80s. And I know that some of the people had begun collecting this in the 60s and 70s. How did you come into this field? How did you come to know of these pictures, and where did you first see them? And when did you develop an interest in actually acquiring them?
I started seeing these images, viewing these images in Radha Prasad Gupta's residence. Radha Prasad Gupta and my family connect, it goes a long way. In fact, he had offered me a drink, and just move away a little bit. He had offered me a drink, I was probably in class 12, and I had it and went back home. And my father was very upset with the fact that I had come back so late. There was no mobile in those days. So he said, "Where were you?" So I said, "With RP." So there was a sigh of relief that I was with RP, and I was also given the book because I was the courier person often enough for Baba and RP. Anyway, and RP Kaku said that because he had offered me a drink, his wife pulled him up that evening and said, "Don't you remember? We were at the hospital to see Jeet, it was just the other day." So that is when I was born. So sometime a December night they were at Woodlands. So that is how far back it goes.
No, but
And
let me ask you here, so
no.
R.P. Gupta collection is where you first saw some of
I
these
first
prints.
saw, absolutely right.
Do you remember which were the presses from where they came?
No, I saw, in fact they are still there. They are still there. Some of the Shundaris were there. There's some other work. But there's about half a dozen of his collection or his images which are on his drawing room wall.
And we have them digitized in our
Correct.
archives. Now tell me something. So RP is...
So I first saw it there.
Okay.
I, like most teenager, or I was very curious as a teenager. So I would ask him, "Where is this from? Where is that from?" "Oh, this is from here, is it? But how come this looks so different and that looks different?" And then the final, or once a year, when I was in my 20s, once a year, RP would call me up. I used to call him RP, Kaku. So RP would call me up and say, how are you placed on say Thursday or on Friday? So I would say that if I was not, he would fix on a date, and then he said, you're staying here for the day and you're also having lunch, which meant I, as a strong kid, would help him by pulling out the trunks
And seeing the pictures.
taking out those prints and putting them out in the shade, not in the sun, but in the shade. And he was a fabulous storyteller. So what he did was, for the first time, I was seeing all kinds of images.
Because there would have been Kalighat paintings,
Right.
Potala prints, along with these.
And so he would educate me in my jargon. He would not go into a high pricing. In my jargon, he would educate me. He said, this is the story of this print. Or if there's an anecdote or there is an interesting
So what
story.
interests me is that
So-
he asked the question, did he take you into the details of a picture? Saying
No.
this is the technique,
No,
this is the press.
he didn't take me into the detail because I wouldn't have understood the detail at that point of time. I was not qualified to understand the detail. So that is why I said he told me the story in my jargon,
Okay.
in my kind of way.
Tell me again, then after, say, your first initiation into looking at these pictures, just as mine was, is in the home of Chatul Babu R.P. Gupta. But then R.P. Gupta also led me to many other collections. So that is what any good guide does, which is that he shows, or any good collector does, is that they show you what they have, and then if you're a researcher, they will also give you leads to many others where these collections could be. So very often you would say...
I was not a guide, I was a helping hand.
Okay, but how did you then say, after seeing these in RP's collection, where else did you encounter them? Did you go to other places where you would also see them?
I kept seeing images like these, but only few in number here and there. And I liked some images, but in those days I was not in a position to acquire them.
Sure.
I started acquiring them once I was in a position, and it was also pointless for me to try and understand how much something would cost, because I had no money to spend on it. So by the time I started, I was in advertising. I was an advertising
So
filmmaker.
from the time you first saw them with R.P. Gupta, it's possibly the 60s and 70s, right?
No, 60s. I was born in the 60s.
Okay, so 70s.
I saw them in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s.
Okay. And R.P. Gupta passes away in 2000.
In 2000. I
So
saw them.
your next time you are beginning, is somebody actually telling you about dealers? Because I'm interested also in the networks of, because many people who may have owned them was also selling them. So if you assume, as the title of the exhibition says, that they existed both in the parlors and in the prayer rooms of middle class and elite homes, there was clearly a demand, a taste for these pictures, whether or not they were classified as high art or not. I think depending on the nature of the picture, they may have been in the parlor, in the Boithokhana, or they could have been in the inner rooms. So for instance, a lot of the pictures of women dancing, playing a tabla, playing a tanpura, which he's calling the Shundari series, they were given names like Monoda Shundari, Pramoda Shundari, Golab Shundari. So they would have been more parlor kinds of pictures, and the rest would have been more religious, but there's an overlap. So there are homes in which these works existed during the time they're being made. So clearly there's a market, and there's an all India market, because very often the names are the titles are in 3 languages, English, Bangla and Hindi. I used to think this only of one studio, but now I see many other studios. But I think the time when these paintings are also moving out of their original collections is the time when figures like R.P. Gupta, Neha Chakraborty, Shubha Tagore, in whose son's house I saw these pictures, are developing a taste for this and acquiring them. So there is a transition already from the homes where they would have first existed into the market. Same is true for Kalighat pictures and all, but Kalighat pictures by then had a far greater market value and aesthetic value. So I'm here thinking then that they are collecting, and we don't really have a history of where R.P. Gupta acquired it from. But one thing he said, that he acquired it very cheap. He said, I was a corporate officer. I was not coming from a very wealthy family. But if you have the eye, and Porimal Rai said the same thing, that if you have the eye, you can get these material out of scrap dealers, warehouses, all kinds of places.
Absolutely.
So they were literally rescuing them from junkyards. But by the time you are coming into collecting, already these are becoming collectible items. And here I'll give you just 2-3 leads. See, in the 80s, the collections are growing. I know of a scholar called Christopher Pinney in London, who was collecting these prints and writing about them. So it's a kind of area where a collector and a scholar often come together. To be a scholar in this field, you need to collect, because otherwise you cannot assume that there's a ready collection there. So there are scholars who begin to collect, like Jyotindra Jain, like Christopher Pinney, Kajri Jain, much more the Shivkasi material she begins to collect. There are also figures like A.L. Basham, very well-known historian of ancient India. I was surprised to see that he had a great interest in what he called popular Hinduism. So lots of scholars in the West, by that time, are also moving from what they call high textual Hinduism into the popular taste, cult, and visual field. And that's how Basham begins to collect these pictures. They're being collected in the USA too, and small collections are beginning to be formed in archives in Australia, where Basham was, and in the US. So by that time, one of the things that strikes me is that by the time you're coming into this work of collecting, these have become collector's items. So there's a price for them, and maybe there are also dealers who are now particularly interested. They know who are the proper buyers, and they will approach you. So can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's a big transition.
What had happened was, this was not the bread and butter of most dealers.
Yeah.
This was, they dealt with in other things, and this was a supplementary thing that they also dealt with or dealt at. So there were dealers coming with saying, if I want X, Y, Z, to which I would say no. And then as an afterthought, they would mention, oh, I also have a few prints.
Okay.
Because this was not generating enough revenue for the dealer to be living off prints.
So normally, do dealers specialize in a particular kind of art? Say,
Right.
Would you have a dealer who deals only with, say, Kalighat painting, another dealer who would deal only with maybe Bengal school art, if it comes up? Are there specializations?
No, they aren't
there?
specialized things. But what has happened is, there are dealers, the average dealer, they deal in everything which is print. So if they have graduated from being, the print being a section of their collection, to people who have become print dealers.
Okay.
Because the market has expanded, the volume has also expanded, the volume the monetary volume has expanded. So because of which, আগে যেটা 1 টাকা which was 1 rupee is now 10 rupees.
So can you tell us a bit about your first set of collecting?
Or the first.
And when and how? You don't have to tell us the prices because often these are not things that people like to. So that's fine. But I'd like to know when and how you acquired your first set. And then you began to expand.
It never came as a set. It always came as
from
loose,
different presses.
Different places, and never as a set. Always as একটা এই print আছে. You know, there's only one print of. I mean, I have 2 of Mahapada. Will you be interested?
Okay.
And or
so
I have.
Which year are you talking about, Jeet?
I'm talking about late 90s, very late 90s. I was in a position to buy small prints, and because they were also inexpensive in those days, but in about 10 years' time, or about in 7-8 years' time, what happened was
the price would have gone.
The price
moved 5 times. Huh?
The price moved 5 times.
I would imagine that.
And then your exhibition in 2008. In 2006 at Birla, which was a grand success. I mean, even now people connect with me or get in touch with me, or when I meet people, they say, "Oh, I'm a collector, and I started collecting after seeing your exhibition."
But you know, in that
so
exhibition,
a lot of people. There's one guy who has said this, who keeps saying this, who's a mid-sized, not a small. He's a mid-sized print collector. His name is Arindam Raut.
Yeah, I've met him. Yeah.
So Arindam has told me that he
began collecting after seeing this.
I became a collector because of you, sir.
So tell me something. So which, if you could remember, which are the, maybe if you were first collected 10, which presses would they have come from?
I didn't understand press. I didn't understand.
But you were looking at the details, right?
I wasn't even looking at those details. In fact, that is when I started calling you up. I was inspired. That is what I want to always say. I was inspired by Radha Prasad Gupta, but you did the hand-holding and education for me. If you remember, I used to call you up
so what guided?
At like odd hours, and I was saying, "Etate lekha royeche printed in Germany." Etar mane ki go? Mane what is it actually printed in Germany? Why would a Radha Krishna be printed in Germany? I mean, or something similar, or something as stupid as that. I used to call you up and ask you, and that is how I was slowly getting educated about things.
But clearly, you know, when a dealer realizes that you are a potential buyer, they will also approach you saying, "I have some maybe Chodbagan studio prints.
They also didn't know.
I have some Supriya Banerjee prints."
They also didn't know. They said prints, and that is how it stopped, or that is where it stopped, because they were unable to differentiate between a Bhavani Charan Laha and a Mahapada.
Okay.
So for them it was the same thing. And then when I started learning, largely from you, I was pointing out, and that is how some of the smaller dealers, they also got educated by it, and then they realized that, so on, they started dividing it artist-wise, not art-wise, or press-wise.
When you didn't know the artist.
Right.
So what is interesting is that if you began collecting only in the late 1990s, clearly by the time I'm curating this exhibition, and if I'm not wrong, we'd have done it in 2006.
Yeah.
So exactly around this time, March 11th to 25th, 2006. So it means that already by then you have a very substantial collection, because I remember we covered prints from Calcutta, prints from Western Indian presses, a few from Gorakhpur, and some from generally North Indian presses. So if I could say, the way this field of collecting emerged and the area of scholarship was that R.P. Gupta had, from what I now realize, collected primarily from 4 presses. Calcutta Art Studio, and I'll come a bit to the history of these presses, from Kasharipara and Chorbagan Art Studio, and from a studio which intrigues me a lot because their work is quite distinctive, called Imperial Art Cottage. Their locations are interesting. Kasharipara is Krishnadas Paul Lane, Chorbagan is Bhuvan Banerjee Lane, and Imperial Art Cottage is Tagore Castle Street, Pathuria Ghata. So I think, and Calcutta Art Studio was in Beaubazar Street. So this is where RP's collection came. He did not really have Bamapada Banerjee or...
He had a couple of Bamapada which I even saw the other day.
Maybe he did, okay.
A couple.
But it didn't strike me. What struck me was the continuity with Kalighat and Bottala, and into the same area in which this transaction and this picture trade was growing. Then you had scholars like Christopher Pinney. When I was in Oxford doing my PhD thesis, he was collecting these prints, and his book called Photos of the Gods, the printed picture in political struggle, comes out actually the year of this book, 2006, because I referred to it. There, his main interest, he begins in Calcutta, he's looking at Pune, the Ravi Verma, many presses which come up using Ravi Verma's name, but he's spanning out into North India. So he's looking very closely into temple towns like Mathura and Nathadwara, which are major depots. And he's collecting a huge number of these prints. So he's a collector cum scholar. So is Jyotindra Jain. Jyotindra Jain is actually beginning an archive called Center for Indian Visual Culture. I think it's called Civic, where not just these prints, he's also interested in advertisements and many other work. Then there's a scholar called Kajri Jain who writes a book called Gods in the Bazaar. She is looking at what we call calendar pictures more specifically, which is not framing pictures. These, I think, were framing pictures. They were made to be just framed. They didn't come as part of a calendar. She was looking at what is broadly called calendar, and she's making an argument about who the artists were, who the presses were, but she's looking at Shiv Kashi in Tamil Nadu as a major depot, and she's again collecting. So what's interesting is these figures of scholar cum collector who are building archives. And then we at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences began, because we couldn't collect. We didn't have the money for collecting, nor the the facilities you need to preserve this work. So we just documented it and catalogued them. And Jeet's collection was one, he also documented them. So beginning with R.P. Gupta, and some Marwari homes too, they would be there side by side with oil paintings. Jeet's painting was a substantial collection in Calcutta, and it covered two ends of the country. So that is what was interesting, and we were able to show it. Now what's interesting here is that the prints themselves aspired for an all India market, but it's also now interesting, as you were saying, that once they dispersed from the first, let's call them the first homes in which they would have come in, into maybe second homes who were now acquiring them more as collectibles with an interest in 19th century popular culture, into another home like maybe Jeet's. They had acquired greater and greater value, artistic value, collecting value, exhibition value. There are exhibitions held on this material. So, and they're now coming again. It's as if they're returning to a collector like Jeet from all over the country. So that to me is interesting, that when the dispersals happen, they move out of Kolkata, and now I'm not saying too many of them are moving back here. I wish they would, but there are units like the Delhi Art Gallery which acquires a huge number. In fact, when they had a museum here, some of it was in view. So I want to ask you, what is this All India network now that you tap into?
All India network is...
I mean, you're based here.
I'm based here.
But you travel to Bombay, you travel to Delhi.
I was in Bombay for a lot of
time.
But
you're saying now much of this material, initially your material came out of Kolkata dealers. Now
some
are they coming Kolkata, from
now
elsewhere?
They're coming from everywhere.
So tell us a bit about this everywhere.
there is a man called Chuni Babu, Chuni Babu Naulakha. His grandson, Chuni Babu, had this beautiful house on Kamak Street, and he was a art and before the Antiquity Act, he was also an antique dealer. His grandson, who now has moved back to Jaipur, I was speaking to him, and he is very adamant, or he was very keen, not adamant, sorry the word, he was very keen that if I could part with some of my prints. So even dealers in Jaipur are interested in Bengal prints. And Bengal prints, I got some Bengal prints last year from Delhi. I've got Bengal prints from in Bombay. Fewer, they're largely Western Indian prints in Bombay. So Bengal prints, it is not restricted to Bengal any longer. It is all over the place.